Muy buenos días, tengan todos y todas. Muchas gracias por unirse a esta sesión virtual para llevar a cabo el webinar sobre protección consular, acceso a servicios de identidad jurídica y diáspora. El día de hoy el objetivo que tenemos es poder dotar a todos los y las funcionarias públicas y a las partes interesadas de una comprensión global de la gobernanza de la migración y de la identidad jurídica, incluyendo la protección de datos, el uso de documentos de identidad para acceder a los servicios esenciales y la verificación y aceptación de documentos alternativos. Además, durante esta reunión se van a abordar las funciones de los consulados y de los procedimientos sobre el visado. Antes de ya dar inicio oficial a la reunión del día de hoy, quisiéramos recomendarles el uso de audífonos con micrófonos para cuando hagan sus intervenciones. De este modo podremos evitar el eco en las habitaciones y así poder facilitar la interpretación simultánea. De acuerdo con la política para el uso adecuado de la información de la CRM, se prohíbe cualquier reproducción o difusión de este contenido de forma parcial o total, en vivo o en diferido, en cualquier medio de comunicación. Esta información es propiedad de los países miembros de la CRM. A su vez, les recordamos que este evento cuenta con interpretación simultánea. En el icono de mundo que se encuentra en la parte inferior derecha, se puede elegir el idioma de su preferencia. Tenemos interpretación en inglés, así como también en el español, en el caso que se requiera. Asimismo, agradecemos por favor mantener sus micrófonos cerrados cuando no estén haciendo uso de la palabra. Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Marisol Aguilar, de parte de la Secretaría Ejecutiva de la CRM. Les damos también la bienvenida. Y para dar oficialmente esta bienvenida a todos y a todas ustedes, me gustaría darle la palabra a Luz Urbina, que es coordinadora del Grupo de Trabajo sobre Protección de la CRM. Entonces, adelante, por favor, Luz.
Buenos días, ¿se escucha?
Sí.
Delegates of the member states and observer organizations, executive secretary, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on access to legal identity, services and diaspora mapping tools. As the pro tempore president of the RCM, Belize is honored to lead this important discussion, which is critical to our collective efforts to improve migration governance in our region. Legal identity is a fundamental human right that allows access to a range of essential services, including education, healthcare, and social protection. It is also crucial for the socioeconomic integration of migrants and diaspora members. Today's webinar is focused on strengthening the tools and frameworks that enable us to provide these services, thus making a significant impact on the lives of those we serve, ensuring their rightful place in our societies. It builds on the outcomes of our previous seminar held in Panama, where we identified key strategic alliances to enhance access to these legal identities. Throughout this morning's session, we will explore global and regional perspectives on legal identity, address the challenges faced by our diasporas, and examine practical examples, including Belize's own initiatives in this area. This webinar serves as a vital platform for sharing knowledge and enhancing capacity of our government to more effectively support migrants and diaspora communities. I am confident that the presentations and discussions today will provide valuable insights and practical solutions that can be implemented across our countries. Once again, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to a productive session.
Muchas gracias, Luz, de parte de la Presidencia Pro Tempore de la CRM de Belice 2024. También me gustaría ahorita cederle la palabra al colega Olivier Tenis. Él trabaja en la OIM, en la Oficina Regional de la OIM, y le cedería la palabra para que se pueda también introducir. Adelante, por favor.
Muchas gracias. Esteemed President Pro Tempore of the RCM, delegates of the member states of the RCM and the Secretariat, of course, of the RCM, esteemed participants. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar organized by the Regional Conference on Migration and supported by the International Organization for Migration. We are here to delve into critical issues regarding access to legal identity services and consular protection, which are essential components for effective migration management in our region. As you know, legal identity is a fundamental for accessing a range of rights and services, including healthcare, education, and legal employment. It also supports safe, orderly, and regular migration. Unfortunately, over 10% of the world population lack of legal identity documents recognized by competent authorities, including 33 million of people in Latin America, of which 8 million are concentrated in Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic alone. Without proper documentation, migrants risk being excluded from essential services, facing exploitation, or encountering difficulties with regularization and family reunification. The IOM role is pivotal in advancing legal identity and consular support, as it is driven by a comprehensive strategy that aligns with global frameworks like the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. A significant aspect of this work is highlighted in our recent regional study on mechanism for access to legal identity for migrants in Central America, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. The study provides a comprehensive overview of how migrants access to legal identity documents, including civil registration systems in countries of origin, legal identity management, and consular assistance. Overall, most countries are centralized systems for civil registration, but face challenges in document validation and cost for migrants with irregular status. The quality of consular services varies, and while technological advancements have been made, significant gaps still remain. Today, our objective is to enhance your understanding of managing legal identity, effective and comprehensive visa and admission management, identifying needs in terms of legal identity, and the challenges faced by the diaspora in acquiring legal identity. Our goal is to equip you with valuable insights and practical tools to address these challenges and advance our collective efforts in migration governance. Thank you very much for joining us today and for your commitment to these critical issues. I look forward to a productive and insightful seminar. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Olivier, por estas palabras introductorias. Bueno, en ese sentido ya podríamos dar inicio al contenido que tenemos preparado para el día de hoy. En ese sentido le daría la palabra a nuestra colega María Ahmad. Ella nos va a explicar sobre el marco de identidad jurídica, perspectiva global y regional. Adelante, por favor, María.
Bueno, thank you very much, Marisol. Muchísimas gracias a todos los colegas. I'm going to present in English, but I'm happy to answer any questions in Spanish as well. Just to introduce myself, I am the legal identity focal point for the Americas. And so I provide technical assistance, guidance, capacity building to all the countries in the Americas and work in joint coordination support with Olivier. So thank you very much for the interest on part of all the members of the CRM who are wanting to be here today and spending this time and dedicating this time to actually get to know in depth the challenges that we are facing and to actually work on legal identity as a key feature of the findings and the conversations that have been had before this. So with that, I am going to start. I'm going to have two interventions today, two presentations. And the first one is to help understand a broad overview of some of which Olivier has just shared right now, a broad overview of legal identity, a little bit about its history, how we started working, how the UN organizations, how globally legal identity has become a priority over the last 6 to 7 years. And secondly, in the same presentation, I'll be talking a little bit about how IOM has its institutional strategy around legal identity and what it is that we understand as legal identity as a operational process, as well as how it should be ensured, the ethics and the practices around it. So that'll be the first part of the presentation, and then one of the parts of legal identity that we do under IOM is consular support as well, wherein my colleague will be joining us to speak a little bit about that, and then I'll come back again to speak more in detail and specifically about the challenges in the region and the potential solutions and support that IOM has for that. So with that, I'm actually going to now start sharing my screen. And Marisol, if you can please let me know that you can see my screen and everything is clear for everybody, we will then get started on that, yeah? Can you see that?
I can see your screen.
Great. Right. So we're going to start, as I said, with understanding a little bit about legal identity. And so with that, I will request everybody to just tune in for a couple of minutes here, not even a minute, perhaps a little less than that, to understanding how we define legal identity, how legal identity actually, the components that it brings together.
Everyone has the right to be recognized as a person before the law. The registration of legal identity is necessary for everyone to acquire a name, a nationality, and family relations. It is therefore championed on both Sustainable Development Goal Target 16.9 and in the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration Objective 4. So what is legal identity? Legal identity is defined as the basic characteristics of an individual's identity, for instance, name, sex, place, and date of birth, conferred through registration and the issuance of a certificate by an authorized civil registration authority following the occurrence of birth. In the absence of birth registration, legal identity may be conferred by a legally recognized identification authority. This system should be linked to the civil registration system to ensure a holistic approach to legal identity from birth to death. Legal identity is retired by the issuance of a death certificate by the civil registration authority upon registration of death. Legal identity belongs to a person, not to a state. And yet, there are many migrants without any proof of legal identity. Without such proof, like an ID card, one has difficulties accessing fundamental rights and services. Ensuring everyone's access to legal identity can therefore be a powerful tool to protect against poverty, exploitation, and statelessness. How can legal identity be provided to all migrants by 2030? In our globalized world, proof of legal identity is crucial to travel and cross borders. People living outside of their countries of birth face even greater challenges to access registration systems. Improving national civil registry and legal identity systems to register the legal identity of non-nationals as well as nationals abroad will help to protect migrants against discrimination and empower them to exercise their fundamental rights while also making regular migration more accessible for all. To these ends, we call on government to increase their political commitment to legal identity and to prioritize resources towards the strengthening of relevant technical expertise. Data to establish legal identity must also be collected in conformity with human dignity and human rights. Everyone has the right to be recognized as a...
And so with that basic introduction to legal identity, I'm actually now going to get into how we actually operationalize that definition. So legal identity is defined as the characteristics of an individual's identity, as we just saw, the name, sex, place, birth, place and date of birth, through registration and issuance of a certificate by an authorized civil registration authority. So in different countries outside of course, we are specifically dealing with Latin America and the Caribbean, outside of here, as well as in other continents, there are other situations and countries where the outreach of national infrastructure is not as robust around the country. And so there are different slightly informal ways where individuals or small institutions are actually authorized to complete this process upon the birth of a child. The important thing is that these individuals, institutions, organizations are actually linked up to the National Civil Registry. And so through them, ensuring that everyone has the right to be recognized as a person before the law. These are rights which have been enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as well as the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and Members and their families. So there are different frameworks globally and regionally that protect and ensure and guarantee this right. Now, what is a challenge, which we're going to be talking later in the day, and of course is the main focus of today's conference or today's webinar as well, is understanding the different challenges that have been there and continue to evolve in ensuring the implementation or ensuring the guarantee of this right. So coming back to the operational definition of this, we actually have an operational definition primarily so that organizations that are working on it, that there is a certain minimum standard of what is the information that is required to assign someone a legal identity or to confer a legal identity of an individual by the state. Of course, as we understand by now, the responsibility and the role of issuing a legal identity is by the state, and it is conferred by the national body of the state. With that, legal identity, as it is a prerequisite to all basic rights and accessing all services, the Sustainable Development Goals established a specific target, 16.9 and 10.7, which relates to migration and legal identity as well. But primarily 16.9 is the one not only for migrants, but for all individuals globally, everywhere. That target is to ensure people have legal identity. Now, in relation with that, Target 10, which has to do with reducing inequalities, which of course is if you are denied access to basic rights and services, that in itself indicates an inequality. And so in 10.7, specifically targeting migrants and how migration is related to legal identity as well, is one of the key priorities for IOM. In taking that target itself, the Global Compact for Migration, which is IOM's lead framework, has several objectives and that relate directly to legal identity. Of course, the number one being objective number 4, in ensuring that all migrants have proof of legal identity and adequate documentation to ensure their mobility and their right to mobility. Thereafter, we actually have objective 7 and objective 14 as well. And in just also to cover and share with everyone that the SDG target 17.9, which I have not shared here, that also aims that by 2030, we should build on all existing initiatives supporting statistical capacity building in developing countries to achieve 100% birth registration and 80% death registration. As Olivier was saying earlier, this goal is obviously very far in reach. We have, because interestingly, there are statistics vary because, of course, these people are undocumented. So there are estimates of different numbers, but yes, close to 1 billion people without legal identity globally. And amongst that, more than half of the world's countries lack fully functioning systems of universal registration of deaths and births. Keeping this as a priority, in January 2018, the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Executive Committee, then requested that all UN entities should develop, in collaboration with the World Bank, a common approach for registration and legal identity challenges. And therefore, the legal identity expert group was then made about 9 months later in September 2019. As you can see, there was over 14 UN agencies, 2 economic commissions that were part of it. The idea of this UN League was that we should have a harmonized, a synchronized, a coordinated approach from all UN agencies and international institutions like the World Bank itself in helping member states developing a holistic idea and understanding of civil registration, helping them with different systems that can ensure civil registration, vital statistics, data management, identity management of all their citizens and all individuals globally. And so with that is how this group was started in 2018, and that is also where the operational definition of legal identity, which I shared earlier, became the primary focus and the primary instrument of ensuring legal identity for individuals, so that all organizations working on legal identity have a minimum understanding of what are the minimum pieces of information that are required to ensure legal identity of an individual. The UN League was then was ended in July 2019, and then it was there was much more work that went into establishing what it was going to be like, how it was going to work, and then a UN legal identity agenda was developed through this group as to ensuring what were the different targets, what were we going to be doing, how were we going to ensure it. And so the UN Legal Identity Agenda Task Force was then made as part of the UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund. So these UN agencies that I've just shared here with you, all the member agencies, are working on legal identity. Of course, everyone is working in their specific area. So for example, IOM works on ensuring legal identity for migrants. UNHCR's primary focus is ensuring prevention of statelessness through ensuring legal access to legal identity, as well as legal identity of refugees and asylum seekers. UN Women working on specifically female, working on females who don't have access to legal identity. UNICEF specifically working on children without legal identity, whether they're migrants, refugees, etc. So all these different UN agencies are working within their space, within their mandate of ensuring legal identity on ensuring legal identity for their specific target populations. So IOM is, as I mentioned earlier, IOM was also part of this task force, and it became a top priority for us in 2019 as well. Based off of that, I am now going to start talking a little bit about and share very briefly and quickly with you the IOM institutional strategy on legal identity. So here we have 4 population categories that we focus on. So one are people, nationals in their country who need to be registered prior to migrating or traveling abroad. Then we have migrants who live in foreign countries, and they need access to civil registration in the country where they are and in their country of origin, because of course we know that legal identity documents are expire as well over time. It can be your passports, it can be a legal identity card, which has been issued by the state. And so through consular support of the current country of origin while living in the host country, migrants work with their national authorities back home to get new documents. So those are migrants in foreign countries. Then we have vulnerable mobile populations, which are people who can be displaced by force, by choice, people who are displaced by force, and people who migrate. Then we have victims of trafficking, where legal identity then intersects with protection concerns and international humanitarian law. So these are overall vulnerable mobile populations, and as I was mentioning earlier, children as well, which is a growing concern, particularly in the region where we are, as more and more children are either separated, orphaned, lost during migration, and And that's something, I mean, I want to talk a little bit further in the presentation as well. And the last category are irregular migrants. Again, a priority for this region as well. Many migrants who are undocumented even before they start the journey, lose their documents during the journey, or when have arrived, the documents are invalid, they've expired, etc. So irregular migrants in a country of destination. So these are the 4 categories where IOM specifically focuses on ensuring legal identity. Amongst our 4 pillars through which we work on legal identity, one is developing and helping build the capacity of consular services, which can then help their nationals in other countries on civil registration, citizenship certificates, ID or travel documents. We specifically work, as I mentioned earlier, assisting migrants without proof of legal identity. The third pillar is making sure national ID systems, which includes the civil registration, the ID management system, are up to date so that they can actually not only just up to date, but there's enough adequate infrastructure, there's enough adequate capacity of staff so that they can support and facilitate regular migration and mobility. And last but not the least, our main focus is working on understanding the evolving challenges. As I said, there are challenges that we are familiar with, but as we see more and more in each of the different countries, we have, as I'll go further to talk about it, there are a range of challenges, whether from policy to hardware infrastructure to software challenges as well today, through capacity of staff, etc. So there are a range of probabilities, to be honest, which match up, where we actually may have something which starts as a hardware challenge, but then ends up becoming a policy challenge as well. And so there is a range of research and investigation and understanding of all of these things. How do bilateral frameworks work with regional frameworks, or how are bilateral frameworks working with international frameworks? And how do we ensure that there is a do no harm principle, which brings me to the principles that are essential when we are dispensing with this work. When we are looking at equality and non-discrimination for all those who are trying to access legal identity, ensuring that all populations within all countries, specifically we work with migrants, but everyone everywhere, regardless of their faiths, their beliefs, their sex, their religion, etc., their gender, have equal access to legal identity documentation, ensuring that all our work prioritizes people, prioritizes migrants. It is people-centered, that we take into account not only their feedback, but also understanding what their specific individual challenges are as they are along the migration cycle, from pre-migration to the end, where they are actually integrated parts of other societies. A rights-based approach, a do-no-harm approach, and more than anything, the protection and privacy of personal data. Now, all data is, as I was mentioning earlier, although all UN agencies and other organizations, institutes like the World Bank work with legal identity data, this data is always managed by the state itself. UN agencies do not hold any legal identity data. And so ensuring that systems, structures, staff dealing with these with this data understand the importance and really the sanctity of this data, and what it is to an individual, is part of the work as well, is part of that capacity building, and it's part of ensuring that we have that built into our hardwares and softwares as well. So these are some of the very core principles that we work with. Now, in terms of implementation, and this is something I will expand upon later on as well. We're working on expanding our capacities, our institutional and technical capacities, so that we can be of better service to all member states. We are working with the rest of the UN agencies as well, wherein, for example, for those of you who might be familiar with the work on legal identity in the region, you'll know that IOM is working not only with UNICEF, but also works with UNHCR, UNFPA, these different agencies in different ways of ensuring that we have a holistic approach of how we are actually reaching out to those who need access to legal identity systems in coordination and in coherence with international laws and standards, as well as regional frameworks. And last but not the least, we seek to strengthen our partnerships with a broad range of actors and stakeholders, wherein where every one of these organizations, of course, is playing a very important part. But for some, I've heard these comments before about how the private sector has a part in this, but I think a very key part of understanding is that the private sector is the main backbone of developing these infrastructures, technical infrastructures, hardware, which is providing the hardware support in ensuring legal identity. So they too are a very key part of this. And so when we talk about capacity building, we are talking about the capacity building of all of these different actors and the different parts of the legal identity process that correspond to each one of them, and ensuring that they all are on board with it. It is, for example, if we're talking about legal identity data protection, this will be, while organizations like the UN or the World Bank, for example, may be much more familiar, government agencies, government arms will be more familiar with the idea of protection of data. But we have all these other range of actors, from the very local grassroots level to the civil society, to national levels, who do not daily deal with legal identity, but who have to access, who may have access to legal identity data during emergencies or during disasters or conflicts. And so building their capacity and building capacity across the board is one of the key priorities for IOM as well. In all the work that we do, as I'm saying, building these, ensuring capacity across the board, this capacity also then includes, making sure that systems are have proportionate means to achieve legitimate objectives. And I think there has been a question around what legitimate objectives are. And this, while we can discuss it later, one of the main things is using, a quick example is using legal identity data, which obviously is stored and is accessible by state authorities. We have seen cases around the world where legal identity data has been used specifically to discriminate or exclude specific groups or specific ethnicities or races, etc. So it is very important to understand that the systems that we are building, while they may gather a lot more information, we also need to understand what is the end use of this information, and how do we ensure that long after the data has been collected, the biometrics have been collected, how does that information continue to provide to be protected, but also how does it meet legitimate objectives? Legislative frameworks are in place, not only for ensuring access, but of course protection of individual information. How do we compensate in case there is violation of this privacy? How do we compensate individuals? How do we protect them in case their privacy has been violated, or there has been incorrect identification, which is not necessarily intentional? We have cases where there are biological changes due to which identification is no longer correct, or that biometric specifically is no longer correct to identify a person. So it can be voluntary or involuntary. And then, as I said earlier, making sure that we are people-centered, making sure that we include affected stakeholders in the process of how we are developing these new pillars, how we're going to be implementing, how we're going to be protecting, how we're going to develop new ethics or frameworks. So that is a quick introduction to where IOM's strategy is, how we are broadly thinking of ensuring and protecting legal identity. And with that, I'm going to stop here now. We are going to take questions towards the end of the presentation. For right now, I will actually now stop so that my colleague can speak more around the work of consular support, which, as I mentioned earlier, is part of the work that IOM does, is help build capacity of consular services so that they can support in providing access to legal identity for migrants in different countries. Over to you, Flor. Thank you very much for your time.
Muchas gracias, María. por esta presentación y esa introducción acerca del marco de la identidad jurídica. Solo dos pequeños anuncios. El primero, para quienes se han conectado un poco después, tenemos interpretación simultánea. Pueden localizarlo en la parte inferior del Zoom en el icono que hay como de mundo. Y también para facilitar la interpretación simultánea, queríamos nada más solicitar hablar un poquitito más despacio para hacer una sesión un poquito más fluida con la interpretación. Entonces, en este sentido, le cedería también la palabra a la colega Flor. Ella nos hablará acerca del refuerzo de las capacidades y la cooperación consular en el tema de visados y admisión. Por favor, adelante, Flor. Flor, you can take the floor, please.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Marisol. Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. Since I had the difficulties with my screen sharing, will you pull up the PowerPoint, please? Perfect.
Yes, sure.
Okay. So let me start already. Very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Floor Bruinsma. I work with Immigration and Border Governance Division with IOM, specifically within the Immigration and Visas unit. And we work with member states to ensure efficient functioning of admission and readmission frameworks to better manage migration. I'll be saying next slide, so that will be sometimes a bit blocking the smoothness of the presentation. Thank you so much. So this is a very simplified image of a migration journey, but it also reflects the where I want to position this presentation. And as I'm working in the immigration and visa space, I will focus on the admissions. And I'm very thankful that there is some time for visa and admissions within this webinar, because I think it will demonstrate the dual or even the multiple role of consulates as well. Obviously, they provide services to own nationals, diaspora populations, but also play a huge role in managing incoming visas, applications, and migration. And when I zoom in on this admission stage of a migration journey, it becomes quite clear that legal identity and secure documentation is absolutely key to uphold the integrity of visa procedures. And the role of consulates is, of course, very straightforward as well, because they play a huge role. Next slide, please. I'll briefly mention what I will be discussing. I'll start with introducing some words on visa procedures and how that relates to the verification of identity within those procedures. I'll then zoom in a little bit on document management, because I think that is a key area where consulates have an important role to play. And then wrap up diving into some of the consular cooperation when it comes to visas and admission. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yep. Thank you. So I'll start with the visa procedures and the application infrastructure, how I usually introduce it. I like to talk about application infrastructures or application landscapes to both refer to the physical infrastructure of visa applications or visa management, meaning consulates or visa application center, but also the digital infrastructure that is surrounding all of these procedures. So a very simplified structure of an application process starts with a pre-application stage. When an applicant is preparing their application, then we move on to submitting the application. The application will be reviewed before it is decided upon. And document verification, as well as the verification of the identity of the applicant, is done throughout these stages. And that really depends on the modalities of the application infrastructure. At the same time, it's also cross-cutting between pre-arrival and post-arrival. So both of these processes, document verification and verification of identity, happen at all stages, happen pre-arrival and post-arrival, depending on the immigration landscape of the relevant country. Now, how is verification of identification done, or of the identity done? It can be in many, many different ways, depending also on the digital maturity, of course, of a country. But it can start with examination of hard copy documents. It can start with examining soft copies, so uploading passport copies or ID papers. Throughout the process, there may also be moments when officials need to cross-check it with other documents, such as birth certificates or marriage certificates. If there is an immigration database, it may be cross-checked with that. And of course, biometric data collection may be a component of it as well. And in principle, this may be straightforward, but it's really important to kind of frame it like as such, so we can also know when to enhance application infrastructures as when there are challenges and risks, especially with identification. Especially when it's a first-time applicant, legal identity is crucial because you need to establish the identity for the first time. The individual is not known to any government official. But also in case the application infrastructure does not allow for any moment for biometric data collection, whether it is post-arrival to issue or create a residence permit, or already pre-departure as part of the application process, there can also be a risk then to move forward with an application sometimes. And of course, crisis, humanitarian crisis or conflicts may of course impact all the application as well. This is a little bit more from the consulate or the government perspective. And next slide, please. I will then dive a little bit into the perspective of the migrant, who often, and as we all know, also face difficulties and obstacles to access visa procedures. And this often starts with an absence of information. There's lack of clarity on the eligibility requirements or the application process, the costs, and the entitlements. And that's also because we sometimes tend to overlook the complexity of it. Immigration and visa procedures have their roots in law, and there's oftentimes legal terminology used that is not easy to understand. And information is also very scattered across different platforms. There might be a central website, but then consulates also have their own web pages, let alone hundreds of other websites that play a role or try to facilitate also visa services. So it's hard to have clarity on information. Even when there is clarity on information and on the visa procedure, it may still be very hard, and it may still be a very complex procedure. It could be digital barriers, it could be logistical barriers, meaning multiple visits to a consulate and so on, lengthy processing times, but also difficulties meeting requirements and to demonstrate eligibility. And here specifically comes also the correct documentation into play. It's not only having a passport, but it's also proof of showing your family relations with to sponsor your child's visa, or to make sure that you have legalized diplomas to be eligible for a work permit visa. And so having that access, having clarity on those kinds of structures that are also tied to your legal identity, and the whole document management is really key to bear in mind, and is also a place where consulates play a key role. While legal legal changes are very hard to implement on a short time, sometimes practical adjustments can be made, and that's also exactly where consulates play a role, as they have most insight into what are the challenges in a local context. And so you try both to be responsive to local needs and contexts, but you also want the overall infrastructure to make to be adequate to respond to global or more macro challenges such as pandemics or economic crisis. And so for consulates or governments, it's absolutely key to also enable some flexibility, adaptability in the way they organize visa management. For instance, in the case that you need to upscale or downscale operations as well. So next slide, please. This is an overview of some of the IOM's admission solutions that we that we sometimes support member states with when it comes to visa facilitation and administrative support, depending on the specific risk or challenge identified. All of those interventions or solutions, or they refer to a task, and by breaking it down, it can help for consulates or for any stakeholder involved in visa management. It can help you to make sure that you have a right response to the specific bottleneck or the specific challenge. Now I want to zoom in on document logistics and document management. Next slide, please. Because this is also an area where consulates have this dual role. They both, of course, manage documents and issue documents for their own citizens and nationals, but also manage documents when it comes to incoming visa applications. And this may also be where some more collaboration between different parts of the consulate can actually cooperate when it comes to storing and archiving, for instance, but also knowledge management of what kind of documents are we actually requesting, what kind of documents are we issuing. If we cannot issue an extract of a civil record at our consulate, can other consulates then actually do that for them, for migrants, if they need it for an immigration application? So there are, of course, many interlinkages. Next slide, please. And particularly on the legalization, it's quite cross-cutting and sometimes overlooked. This is not only legalization of documents, it's not only needed for visa applications, it can be needed for a range of to access social services and so on. And this is very much tied to, of course, legal identity, where we also see that there is a lot of uncertainty and unclarity. What needs to be legalized? What are the required steps? What are the timelines for legalization? And why is it necessary? And so on. Applicants, but also nationals, returning migrants, diaspora, may face a lot of time restraints or financial restraints when they are confronted with those requirements, and especially when there's no clarity. And sometimes it's also the consulate who have a role in managing the apostilles or the legalization procedures. And consulates, among others internally, may seek cooperation to make sure that across the organization or across the consulate, knowledge is shared on how these procedures look like, and also to better then serve migrants and your own populations, to make sure that these services are accessible and clear and don't actually become an obstacle for any process. Next slide, please. Because even when documents are legalized, they may still need to be verified, and which is also one of a very specific area of work where we see in admissions how consulates sometimes struggle to make sure that they have the capacity to verify if a document is representative of what it says it represents. So it's not only to authenticate a signature, it's really to verify that the content of health record is actually accurate. There we also see how consulates can cooperate, especially different consulates of different countries in a particular country. Sometimes it is absolutely necessary to have some sort of field presence. So then in that case, cooperation can be sought also with other stakeholders, other partners. And of course, here is also really important to think back of the application infrastructure, where some parts of the application process are digital, but sometimes document verification may need to be done in person as well. Try to wrap up by my next slide, please, on the consular cooperation and the capacities. I wanted to zoom in and highlight a little bit of the different roles and relationships that we see among consulates. There are relationships between consulates and their home government or the capital. There are different consulates within a specific country and the host government, different departments within the same consulate. For instance, when indeed it's very separated services to own citizens versus services to indeed migrants or non-nationals who may still also need to request extracts if they have potentially lived in the country before, but also to potential migrants. And so it's necessary to analyze, assess those relationships and those roles with the application infrastructure that we talked about, to then also see what can we do practically and operationally, but also possibly on a policy level to enhance visas and admissions management. And I would suggest and encourage that the conversation on facilitating consular services includes visa services, especially when it comes to information services and accessibility. Want to highlight a few of the recommendations as standardizing and streamlining visa protocols, digitalizing visa services, while also ensuring flexibility and, of course, taking into account that not all applicants have access to digital modes of submission. Mobile visa processing units if indeed it is not possible to submit it locally or digitally, and not possible to visit the application center because it's too far. Possibly it's possible to work with mobile units. And then also specifically tailored to local needs is the enhancing support for applicants in vulnerable situations that may change from time to time, but may also continue for longer periods of time. Again, thinking of accessibility or also, if possible, document requirements, adjustments. And lastly, that is overall strengthening information and communication services as a key task also for consulates to lead on and to align with their home governments, but also with other consulates in the region, possibly to align on document requirements and to understand document challenges as well. Thank you so much. I leave it to here, and of course, happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Flor, por darnos esta presentación acerca de los visados, admisión y la cooperación consular en este tema. Para dar continuidad, le daríamos la palabra ahorita a María Eulalia. Ella nos va a hablar acerca de las necesidades de la diáspora en materia de identidad jurídica. Adelante, por favor, María Eulalia.
Muchísimas gracias, Marisol, y buenas tardes desde Ginebra. Buenos días a todo el mundo. Es un placer estar con ustedes en este webinar. Muchas gracias a todos los países de la CRM y a todo el equipo por su invitación. Yo me llamo Eulalia Lali Figueras y trabajo como especialista en Derecho Internacional Migratorio en la Unidad de Derecho Internacional Migratorio de la OIM, acá en la sede en Ginebra. Nos dedicamos a apoyar a los estados y a la organización a diseminar el derecho internacional migratorio y asegurar que todo lo que hacemos, nuestras políticas y acciones, estén en línea con los estándares internacionales y hacemos hablando de derecho laboral, penal, marítimo, derechos humanos, consular y diplomático, etcétera. Es por eso que también estamos aquí compartiendo con ustedes sobre el tema de la identidad jurídica. Como han visto a través de las presentaciones de mis compañeras, la OIM otorga una gran importancia a esta temática con una estrategia que nos precede y acciones concretas que implementamos gracias a la colaboración con los Estados miembros y la sociedad civil. La identidad legal como derecho humano para todas las personas migrantes. Hemos mencionado la Declaración Universal, hemos mencionado la Agenda 2030 y el Pacto Mundial, sin duda, tanto el Objetivo 4 como también el 14, ya que estamos hablando de apoyo a todo el mundo consular y diplomático. Lo que es crucial es adoptar un enfoque holístico de esta identidad legal que pueda extenderse desde el nacimiento de una persona hasta su fallecimiento, lo que significa que la identidad es cambiante, ¿cierto? Y que se va a ver influenciada por muchos acontecimientos, cambios de nombre, de género, matrimonios, divorcios, obtención de la ciudadanía o también la adquisición de un estatus migratorio regular en un país extranjero. Es por eso que hacemos el link directo del acceso a la identidad legal con la migración segura, ordenada y regular. Con el tiempo que me ha sido reservado, que es cortito, me permitiré brevemente compartirles algunas recomendaciones de dos estudios principales de la OIM y consultores que nos apoyan, que van en línea también con los últimos encuentros que realizaron ustedes Salvador y Panamá. Uno de los estudios es el estudio de mecanismos de acceso a la identidad legal y el otro es un estudio elaborado en 2023 sobre la diáspora y las identidades transnacionales, analizando marcos jurídicos y políticas a nivel internacional con varios casos de estudio. Entrando en materia, hemos visto también con anterioridad el caso de América Latina y Caribe, la cifra de personas que carece de prueba de su identidad legal que ronda los más de 30 millones. Esto claramente repercute en la calidad de vida de estas personas, puesto que los documentos que van a probar la identidad legal suelen ser necesarios, ¿cierto? Acceso a derechos, salud, educación, etcétera, y una plena integración. En el ámbito de la identidad legal, el reconocimiento, el rol y el poder que tiene la diáspora, tanto visto desde el marco legislativo como el institucional, se ha convertido en un punto de partida para acciones conjuntas en muchos países. Hemos visto durante los últimos años sobre todo el interés de los estados para movilizar a las diásporas en el extranjero y los compromisos que los migrantes, incluyendo la diáspora, los compromisos transnacionales que se adoptan en el país de acogida y en el país de origen, también muchas veces en el país de tránsito, se han convertido también en esenciales, ¿no? para el desarrollo sostenible y para una contribución plena y sostenible. Los marcos jurídicos a nivel nacional, que es lo que también vemos desde la parte de IML, de Derecho Internacional de la Migración, es la prueba de cómo los estados siguen interesándose y reconociendo esta importancia, este rol de la diáspora, mediante concesión de derechos, satisfacer las necesidades básicas, crear instituciones que se dediquen a la participación de la diáspora y, como este encuentro, la cooperación internacional o regional en este caso. Un par de puntos claves sobre la identidad legal y sobre todo la identidad transnacional de los miembros de la diáspora. Primero de todo, el primer paso lo hemos mencionado, ¿cierto? Es la creación de un marco legal. Para interactuar con las diásporas de una manera efectiva y sostenible necesitamos un marco jurídico que regule al menos ciertos aspectos de este apoyo. Permitir también que las diásporas puedan adquirir doble o múltiple ciudadanía, vamos a verlo más adelante, o por ejemplo expedir tarjetas que puedan ser especiales de registro o de identificación que puedan permitir a estos miembros de la diáspora entrar en el país sin necesidad de visado, etc. La terminología legal, mi compañera ha descrito los desafíos en materia de terminología legal, porque no existe una definición internacional que esté aceptada por todos los países e incluso las organizaciones de las Naciones Unidas, de la sociedad civil, de este término. Tenemos una definición a nivel de OIM, hay una definición a nivel de Naciones Unidas, pero los países claramente tienen la prerrogativa de ampliar o reducir este término según la situación y el contexto nacional, lo que influye claramente en las políticas que se van a adoptar. La doble nacionalidad o ciudadanía múltiple Este es otro concepto jurídico bastante complejo que sigue estando regulado de forma un poco restrictiva en varios marcos jurídicos nacionales, y ya sea porque una persona adquiere la ciudadanía por naturalización de uno o varios estados y conserve la otra. Si bien hay unas ventajas que son muy claras para los propietarios de esta situación legal, hay desafíos y simplemente hay una necesidad de regular para que no haya falta de pago de impuestos, no haya regímenes legales contradictorios o ventajas que puedan ser desiguales. Un par de ejemplos que les quería mencionar, uno lo conocen seguramente muy bien, pero de Colombia y México, son dos casos que hay muchos más, pero que se analizan en el estudio como países de origen y de destino. México, sin duda, como una historia muy grande de construcción de relaciones con la diáspora desde los 90, y se han ido construyendo relaciones muy sólidas y duraderas. El ejemplo claro y más fácil para compartirles de manera rápida con ustedes es la experiencia de Colombia como país que es vanguardista en un enfoque basado en derechos humanos para regularizar y apoyar a migrantes de la región. Estoy hablando de los migrantes venezolanos con el ETPB, con el Estatuto Temporal para proteger a los venezolanos, que tiene alto potencial para reducir los riesgos de migración irregular, de apatridia y sobre todo aumentar la productividad también económica del país en Colombia. Y otro ejemplo de México es el rol y la importancia que otorgan a la diáspora, al rol de la diáspora de cómo investe en el país, etcétera. Entonces son dos países que claramente nos dan muchos ejemplos de construcción muy grata, muy positiva, como países de origen y destino en la importancia del rol de la diáspora. Habría otros ejemplos, también ejemplos que presentan desafíos que no son de la región, como por ejemplo la India, que prohíbe la doble ciudadanía, pero que otorga, por ejemplo, un certificado y unas tarjetas especiales, ¿ciertos? Entonces, lo que nosotros siempre animamos es que cuando tenemos tantas opciones enfrente, hay un abanico de posibilidades que no tiene por qué ser a través de un visado, a través de una ciudadanía, pero también hay otras maneras de que el Estado reconozca la conexión de los miembros de la diáspora con el país y que lo formalice de una manera diferente a la ciudadanía si es necesario. Conclusiones. No existe un modelo eficaz, no existe una talla única, ¿cierto? De manera como enfocar el aporte de la diáspora en materia de identidad legal, tanto como en identidad legal como en otras. Para que los estados se puedan relacionar con las diásporas dependerá del contexto, dependerá de las necesidades también y incluso de contextos regionales e históricos. Sin embargo, lo que es seguro es que institucionalizar las relaciones a través de organismos que están establecidos y de leyes y de políticas claras son los pasos principales para que sean relaciones efectivas y duraderas. La doble nacionalidad, como mencionaba anteriormente, es un mecanismo muy útil para que los estados que quieran reconocer esta identidad transnacional de una persona migrante, puedan apoyarles. Y eso hace que los países de origen mantienen y aumentan los vínculos y que los países de destino también capitalizan y crean condiciones inclusivas para los migrantes. Hay otros mecanismos, otros tools que podríamos explorar, ¿cierto? Derechos políticos, necesidad también de reforzar la capacidad técnica de muchos países, la movilización de remesas, sin duda, compartir habilidades y conocimientos, esto se está haciendo en muchos países, facilitar el acceso a la tierra, a la vivienda, etc. Habría en este sentido algunas recomendaciones que nos podríamos permitir de compartir con ustedes. Las voy a dividir en 5 pasos institucionales. Hemos mencionado que no solo necesitamos las leyes y las políticas, pero necesitamos elaborar mecanismos de coordinación que sean eficientes entre las instituciones, registro civil, migración, consulados, las autoridades policiales también, entidades especializadas que tienen competencia en el registro o que emiten documentos de identidad. Es muy importante que haya un trabajo conjunto para registrar los hechos vitales específicamente de las personas migrantes. No solo en general, pero con un enfoque a las poblaciones más vulnerables, LGBTIQs, niños y niñas, poblaciones indígenas binacionales o poblaciones que no tengan una representación consular cercana. Y aquí, sin duda, sería importante especificar el enfoque de género, lo importante desplegar un enfoque que sea sensible no solo a los derechos humanos, pero al género en las políticas y programas. Hay unas necesidades claras de las mujeres y una vulnerabilidad que puede estar ligada al contexto migratorio, pero también hay una agencia y un rol de contribuidoras muy fuerte, sobre todo en capacidad de identificar problemas, establecer objetivos. Pueden leer más sobre esto en el estudio. 2. Cooperación internacional. Hay varios ejemplos de colaboración en la región que ustedes conocerán mejor que yo, sin duda, para fortalecer los sistemas de registro civil y de gestión de identidad. Y claramente lo importante aquí es voluntad política, ¿no? Willingness político de poder movilizar, explorar acuerdos, discutir, flexibilizar requisitos a veces de documentación que sean necesarios para regularizar el estatus migratorio de una persona, acuerdos bilaterales. La CRM sin duda tiene un rol muy importante que jugar para compartir buenas prácticas en el ámbito de la protección consular y de la identidad legal. Número 3, sistemas de registro civil. Hay que fortalecer y seguir fortaleciendo la cultura de registro mediante campañas de concienciación, descentralizando, ¿cierto? Yendo a acercarse proactivamente a las poblaciones que tienen menos acceso, flexibilizar requisitos, promover unidades móviles del registro civil o de los consulados para que puedan moverse en zonas de difícil acceso, como territorios indígenas o poblaciones que son transfronterizas, y desarrollar capacidades de la sociedad civil para que ellos puedan ser uno de los partners principales en desarrollar todo este ámbito. Cuarto, las autoridades migratorias. Hay muchos países que siguen trabajando sin poner en riesgo y poner en cuestión y en duda la soberanía nacional, la seguridad estatal, flexibilizan procedimientos migratorios para personas que no pueden acceder a estos documentos probatorios, lo que es el caso de muchos migrantes que llegan sin documentos, y también crear estrategias de comunicación para que las personas migrantes puedan conocer el vínculo entre la inscripción de procesos vitales, procedimientos para acceder a la regularización. Puede ser muy complejo. Aquí otra vez la sociedad civil juega un papel esencial para apoyar a la población migrante. Y finalmente, las representaciones consulares. Seguimos trabajando desde la OIM en fortalecer las capacidades de todos los equipos y el personal consular y diplomático en todos los sentidos para tratar de fortalecer el recurso humano en las oficinas y en los consulados, promover también protocolos que puedan ser de homologación de costos o de servicios o de tiempos de entrega, por ejemplo. Modernizar los servicios digitales, lo vemos, la importancia de digitalizar los servicios, a la vez prestando atención a las brechas digitales y a simplificar el lenguaje, que a veces puede ser muy técnico y demasiado digital y ir demasiado rápido. Y seguir creando, ¿no?, alianzas con organizaciones de la diáspora que puedan hacer también el link con estas oficinas y con las necesidades básicas que vayan surgiendo, las prioridades. Finalmente, ¿no?, los migrantes mantienen los vínculos culturales, políticos, religiosos, socioeconómicos en más de un país. Eso está probado y cada vez con la globalización lo vamos a ver más. Y la naturaleza transnacional de estos estilos de vida, de su estilo de vida al final del mundo, porque la migración es un fenómeno que ha existido siempre y que esperemos va a existir. La historia de la migración no es más que la historia de la humanidad, pero simplemente la importancia es reconocer este estilo de vida transnacional y que ese sea el núcleo de la identidad de esas personas, y que el impacto pueda ser reconocido por los estados, pueda ser incluso apropiado por los estados de origen y de destino, reconociendo la identidad transnacional de los migrantes y la identidad legal como derecho humano, y sobre todo capitalizando sobre todos estos beneficios que una identidad legal sostenible y eficiente puede otorgar a todos los países y a toda la sociedad, origen, destino o también de tránsito. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, María Eulalia, por esta presentación. De verdad que creo que todos estos temas es necesario también hablarlos, conocer un poco más al respecto, saber qué podemos aplicar en nuestros países y en sí conocer las necesidades que tiene la diáspora en torno a la identidad jurídica. Bueno, siguiendo con la agenda, le daríamos la palabra otra vez a María Ahmad. Ella nos va a hablar sobre la identidad jurídica y los desafíos de esta. Entonces, por favor, adelante.
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias, Marisol y las colegas, porque me encanta que como rodeamos toda la conversación, estamos llegando a casi una finalización y una comprensión total, holística, de diferentes maneras, a llegar casi al parte final de eso todo. Ahora me voy a compartir mi segunda presentación. Aquí, por favor, me confirmes, Marisol, si puedes verla.
Ahora sí la puedo ver.
Perfecto. Bueno. Great. So on this, I want to start with a little bit of looking at the regional frameworks. This is always the reason why I bring this right now. I did mention earlier the global frameworks that talk about legal identity. I wanted to zoom in a little bit on the regional frameworks because we have obviously colleagues and peers from across the region. So just to kind of have a quick overview of this. And as you will see, there are broadly several migration governance frameworks. And overall, the model of migration governance across Latin America is more and more increasingly open, forward-looking, inclusive, rights-centered, rights-based approach to migration, which is extremely encouraging and really is one of the advancing continents and regions in this manner. As you will see, all of these migration governance frameworks, provide, ensure, guarantee access to temporary residence, obtaining permanent residence, regularization of the migrants, or providing them nationality, naturalization as well, access to the labor market, to the health system, to the education, family unification, and in many cases, voting rights for local elections as well. I think it's also very important to mention here that over the last 4 to 5 years, there have been regularization decrees, many regularization decrees that have been issued. If I remember correctly, since 2000, so over the last 24 years, Latin American region has issued about 90 different regularization decrees. And that's quite a large number, and as you can see, and most of us know, most of them have been post the Venezuelan influx in the region. So the reason why I bring this together, interestingly, is because whenever I have looked at, and this applies to the SDGs as well, this applies to the other goals, targets, and objectives that international organizations and development actors have. What's interesting is that that all of these things, as is this list right now, developed. And yet I was looking at these governance frameworks, and the one where specifically legal identity is mentioned as a basic fundamental human right was the American Convention on Human Rights, which most countries are signatory to. I'm not sure if Belize has already signed it, but that might be the only exception. So most countries are signatories to that. However, in all the other frameworks, legal identity is not mentioned. And like I said, with the SDGs as well, we talk about inequalities, we talk about access to labor, we talk about access to education, to health, etc. And yet, as I shared with you, legal identity is mentioned in one place, So what is interesting, that all this to say that it is important to understand that we all take this as a prerequisite. Legal identity is such a fundamental part of every single thing that we hope to achieve as we hope to achieve human rights and development indicators and targets and goals and objectives. We all almost assume that, of course, there will be legal identity, and thereafter is when we can build on it. And yet we assume it to such a point, we take it for granted at such a point as such a fundamental basic right that we do not even mention it in frameworks often. And so this is just to kind of draw attention to that part, nothing more than that. So, it's all contingent on that one primary document, which, as we said earlier, over 1 billion people in the world, according to rough estimates, do not have access to. So now, before I go further and much more in detail, this is the part that I wanted to talk about, which some of these things my colleagues have already mentioned and have referred to, but I wanted to look at some starting points, although some of them are not starting points. But on the left hand of the screen, you will see some starting point challenges of legal identity, and on the other side you will see how those challenges then transform into other challenges when the same individuals undertake migration. So pre-migration, during migration, in the host country, or when they want to come back home. So just quickly, colleagues have already mentioned, there's a lack of information. New births are not go unregistered. It might be due to lack of information, as colleagues mentioned. It might be because the parents themselves, this is something we're seeing in the region right now. In many cases, parents themselves are missing legal identity documentation, and therefore children are not getting registered. The parents themselves might be migrants, and their legal identity documentation is not yet, the process isn't complete, for example. And sometimes it can be one of these things, and sometimes it can just be a combination of all of these things. We've talked about how there is inadequate infrastructure in hard to access areas or underdeveloped areas across the country. So we all know around border areas, around more rural areas, around areas, for example, speaking within the region, around the Amazonian forest, for example, indigenous populations living in different areas. And what is our access to? What is their access to information? What is their access to such legal identity registration systems? So this is almost looking at it from a very individual perspective and a human-centered or people-centered perspective. So what are their challenges, to stop and look from that side? Loss of documentation in disasters and conflicts, their documents which are taken away by traffickers or criminal gangs, for example. We have situations of statelessness, which is an interesting cycle, because there could be statelessness prior to migration, and there can be and not necessarily because of discrimination, but simply because maybe there's no infrastructure, and basically there is no registration. That person is not counted as part of the state's registry system. So you have that, and if this person chooses to migrate, then, well, they are undocumented, they are irregular in the other country as well, and there is no way to attest their or verify their identity with their country of origin as well. We have registration of life events prevented due to discrimination, national policy. An example, there are many different countries where we can actually start to talk about examples. We have Myanmar, for example, where we have this situation. We have national policy, for example, in other countries, which excludes the state policy itself actually will exclude groups of people. So we have had that. I was recently speaking to colleagues in Suriname, for example, who were sharing that children who are born out of wedlock, for example, what happens to their legal identity? And that's a big challenge over there. And Suriname in the region is now beginning its journey, and there's a great enthusiasm for working on legal identity, but it is one of the countries which is just starting its journey on ensuring legal identity to all its citizens. During with or without migration, we have children who are separated from families or who become orphans. Could be during conflicts, could be during natural disasters, could be a simple natural course of events. So, and they may not be registered prior to that. Ethnic cleansing or discrimination. I think one of the things that Maria Eulalie was just speaking about, there is inconsistency in national, regional processes and initiatives, and this includes policies and frameworks as well. So, for example, when I speak of processes, for example, I've recently been involved in a trafficking case in Uruguay. The trafficking case came to light in early March. And I just spoke to the lawyers and the government representative just a couple of days ago. And over the course of the last 4 to 5 months, the legal identity documentation of the trafficked victims is still under process. And while the state has been absolutely very generous in providing housing, in providing food and clothing, etc., the problem is these individuals cannot even begin to earn, cannot even begin to join the labor market because they do not have valid identification. Their previous documents were taken, were confiscated by their employer, and they are currently without any documentation. And so while all the intention, the great intention and the great support and help is over there, but the process itself is actually taking so long that despite high priority, these individuals have been to the National Registry System a couple of times, and we are still waiting and hoping that by next week, 2 of the 3 will actually have legal identity documentation, and the third one probably has to wait for at least another month. So we are talking about a policy that exists. There's a process that is meant to support them, and yet we don't have them. Earlier I was speaking about, for example, registration that is prevented by discrimination. I mentioned Myanmar, for example, but I'm also going to mention a case which is, of course, outside of the region, but just to kind of raise awareness on the situation. We have cases where in Pakistan and India, for example, where based on religious grounds, people are forced to register incorrect information on their legal identity documentation because the state does not recognize them, and therefore they have to lie to actually to get a legal identity documentation. There have been cases of Haiti, for example, where legal identity documentation has been lost in disasters. We have cases of Colombia where documentation is lost in conflict, for example. So we have examples from both within the region and from around the world as well to understand what are the various situations which even separate from migration are challenges of legal identity. So now looking and moving towards the right side of the screen, when we look at these same cases and when they are in the mobility cycle, when they're on the route of migration, so they're unable to migrate legally, they are, of course, much more vulnerable to trafficking and extortion. As I said, there's undocumented individuals which do not exist in the country of origin. And of course, if they're on the journey to another country, if they die, we have no way of recording their deaths, identifying bodies as well. There is a difficulty in claiming refugee status. There's obviously a risk of deportation, which then again cycles back into becoming vulnerable to exploitation. In many around the world, there are different terms of working informally. Some is under the table, some is black money, etc. So these are all forms of exploitation because legal identity documentation isn't there. In the host country itself, these nationals don't have a protection of their rights. They have very limited access to services and benefits. They cannot register their own marriage. They cannot register the birth of their child. They have an inability to naturalize. They may not be able to become quote-unquote nationals. Now, this idea of naturalization, one of the things that amongst all the other organizations that IOM works, IOM also works with the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is the organization that regulates international travel documents, i.e. passports primarily. And one of these challenges is something that countries like Uruguay and Myanmar, for example, are looking at. How do you actually naturalize migrants? You have all a very progressive migration policy, a migration governance framework, and yet there is a discrepancy in the international framework of ICAO, of the Civil Aviation Organization that has been signed by Uruguay and Myanmar, and yet the national procedures and national processes and policy are in violation of that international agreement that they've signed with ICAO. Children, for example, born to dual nationals in a third country. This is something I was actually thinking about when writing this, that this is something I have experienced personally twice with my children being born in different countries, their father being a national of a separate country, and neither of our countries actually willing to provide legal identity documentation for our children. And the countries where they were born, those countries said, well, this is part of health tourism, and so we do not provide we can give you a birth certificate, but they are not nationals or citizens of this country. So, I mean, there was a point where my daughter was actually stuck between two borders at the risk of statelessness. So these are very unusual, and many people will say, well, you know, these are very rare cases, and so we cannot counter for any rare case. But it's actually, it goes back to the work that IOM does in terms of doing research. We don't have information on this because we don't actually have information or enough coverage of the challenges of legal identity in different circumstances. So this is a work that needs to continue, just to highlight that. Eventually, for people who want to, migrants who want to return home, you know, in this case, it can be return, which can also be a deportation. And so if they don't have legal identity documentation, that may also be a reason for deportation to start with, you know. So there is, without that documentation, they cannot repatriate, you know, coming back and trying to look for any property they may have, or they're accessing rights as a national, as a citizen. They have to, at the very least, start the process again. And as I was mentioning earlier, there are situations of conflict where the entire registry the initial registry may have been destroyed, or or you know, the returning migrants may or may not be included in the registry for various reasons. Again, various forms of discrimination. So these are some of the I wanted to look at a range of challenges around individuals with or without migration. Now, the report that Olivier shared, the report that Malia Ulali just mentioned as well. So this is the report, the mechanisms for accessing legal identity for migrants. And so it is here. And in this, this was one of the figures that I just wanted to share from the report. And again, will highly recommend, like my colleagues, that you please do undertake a reading of that. Very valuable. But this is a very macro look at the challenges of legal identity from infrastructural point of view, from policy, from institutions that are responsible for ensuring legal identity. So there is a situation where we all know that the region is moving more and more towards digitalization of all public services. So as we modernize, there are challenges of interoperability between different systems, between institutions, between countries, between regions. So, you know, you can start from a very small point, which is, you know, lack of infrastructure in hard to access areas, and you start zooming outwards from local to district, to regional, to provincial, to national, to regional, and then international. So that's probably one of the biggest ones that the region is looking at right now. We have a challenge of migrants having trust towards state authorities, you know, so going and registering as well. And here again, I will actually go back and mention that, you know, this case of these trafficked individuals in Uruguay, for example, they do have trust in the state, and yet we are the process is very long. It's very delayed. So, you know, just to kind of bring that together, as mentioned earlier, there is lack of information. There are multiple sources of information. We also have one of the key things that we were working with IOM Uruguay earlier. We were looking at how locally called coyotes were actually advertising services, migration services on social media, specifically on Facebook. And so that's one of the things that we were looking at, how misinformation is advertised and provided so easily and circulated through different social media channels, and on the other hand, information, authentic, verified, reliable information from government institutions is so hard to find. There are multiple sources. And multiple sources, and also a lack of coherence in that information. So one department telling you to do one thing and the other department telling you to do another thing, and often going through the same process at least 2 or 3 times to submit different documents. Something again that I was speaking with colleagues in Suriname about how to get a work permit. But first you get legal identity documentation, you give all your documentation there, then you go to get a work permit, then you have to resubmit all your information again, and yet the system should be at the back end connected to each other, preventing this further delay of permits and documentation to work, right? So a coherence overall in information and how to access that information and everything. So that one, then we have a lack of knowledge on regulations, and there's a lot of discretionary decisions, so often for example, I remember traveling to Argentina, and because I was not going in through Buenos Aires, I went through a land border, and it was interesting to have this conversation with the border official, and she said, "Well, we are not aware of this particular policy or this initiative, and that made for an interesting conversation." So that is, it could have been a discretionary decision on her part to say, you know what, I'm not going to allow you to enter because she does not have backup information. So we have to reduce this possibility of discretionary decisions by different officials as well, by ensuring that we have clear information, not just for migrants on our websites, everything, but also capacity building of our staff. So, and that then links up to the next challenge as well, which is how to access public services if there is no legal identity. So this brings in all our staff from the public health department, the public education department, the public social services department, the labor department, et cetera, all of these departments, as I was mentioning in my previous presentation. That is a key priority for us, is anyone who has to deal with any part of the process which is dependent on legal identity documentation must be part of the process of the capacity building. The digital divide, this is again linked to the first challenge that I was speaking about, adequate infrastructure, but also this is not only for the different government levels, but also for individuals as well. So there, as colleagues were saying, there is information available. For what happens to those migrants or individuals who don't have, a digital device to access information? And often even it's not just accessing information. Often it is a question of literacy, not digital literacy, but literacy itself. So how individuals actually can understand the information. Most of our websites and most of this information is actually not supportive of people who may have a physical disability, who may not be able to read, who may not be able to access it for various physical reasons. We are not ready for that, and we have a tremendous digital divide, and this digital divide is not only amongst all individuals, but a specific one that is a gender digital divide as well. Women's access to digital devices, women's understanding of it, women's ability to use these devices is something that is hampered by their economic positioning. So it is a much broader question. So ensuring that we are able to provide, or actually are able to meet individuals where they are, rather than asking them to come to us. And last but not the least, identification and assistance to people in vulnerable situations. Again, something that we are seeing more and more in the region as mixed migration comes through, as different flows come through, as different crises continue growing in the region. With an overview of all of these challenges from a individual perspective to a large macro perspective, I'd just like to share quickly how IOM can be of support here, and some of IOM's capacity building tools that we have developed over the last 5 years, since 2019, when legal identity was prioritized as a key focus in all of IOM's work. So As I shared earlier, we have a very holistic approach to what we do. So these different tools that you're going to now see, you will see that they correspond to the different parts of the migration circle as well. So initially starting with the legal identity strategy, which I shared with you earlier, based off of that, we have developed a roadshow, which is something I just conducted with the Suriname government, for example, is meeting with different actors, different government actors, including non-government actors like the civil society, like meeting with organizations or groups working with migrants or representing vulnerable migrants or even LGBTQ populations. And so meeting with the various stakeholders to understand what are legal identity documentational challenges. And based off of that, the roadshow then comes out with an analysis of understanding the challenges as well as what are the potential solutions to these challenges. The toolkit, which I'll just share quickly with you as well, which you can see on IOM's website as well, is a combination of the different tools that we have that IOM can provide. We have master classes to help build capacity. We also do various pilot programs with different countries to help them see how it could be, how the process can be done, and from there how they can actually scale the process to a national level and alongside building their capacity. We have the essentials of registration of migrants. So there are several researches, case studies, best practices that we've developed as well, which specifically speak to foundational, functional, and digital ID. Please do note, of course, all these different types of terminologies, of course, are not the one and same thing. They are different forms of legal identity and with different purposes and different ends and means. So then we have the documents issue guide, as I was speaking earlier about the Civil Aviation Organization's document 9303, which is specifically the document and the work that we do with the ICAO around travel identity documentation. We have the free movement zone guides. And by free movement zone, you're very familiar with the Mercosur, you're familiar with the other migration governance frameworks in the region. So it's guidance on that. Then we have the passport examination procedure manual, the PEPM, under identity management. So we have both the manual as well as an app that we have developed. The manual we've just launched the 3rd version of the manual. We have the document examination lab as well. We have Midas, which is a data management system that we help governments establish and support them with that. So as I was saying, the idea is to have a holistic approach across the different parts where we can support member states. And just to quickly share here, as I mentioned, this is the Legal Identity Roadshow that we had conducted earlier, and a presentation on the same. It's roundtable discussions with stakeholders and actors and understanding the opportunities as well as the practices that we can share with them from around the world, and among which they can decide what can work for their state. We have the masterclasses. These masterclasses are provided to any and all legal identity actors. The idea, again, is to broaden capacity as far as possible. This is the toolkit that I had mentioned. I will be sharing this presentation later on with Marisol, so you can use this QR code to actually access the legal identity toolkit as well. Most of the documents that I'm sharing here are things that you can actually find on the IOM website. I have prioritized the first couple of these, the legal identity masterclass, the toolkit, this compendium, and then another study that we've done on standard operating procedures. These are perhaps the first 3-4 that I would recommend highly, considering the theme of today's webinar. I would recommend this because because these are very along with that report on the mechanisms of accessing legal identity. These are perhaps some of the foundational documents that I would highly recommend to everybody to read if you are indeed working in legal identity in any form or shape. This compendium, as you can see, was done with field research in 6 countries, and from the region we had Brazil and Peru. And the idea was to understand how these states were working on establishing legal identity and how they were supporting migrants have access to legal identity documentation when they didn't have any proof of identity. So it was launched late last year in Thailand, and provides for a range of potential contexts due to which people may not have access to legal identity. This, as I was mentioning, this standard operating procedure document has just come out. We've just launched it last month. I was very proud of seeing this and editing the final version of this because it truly is a representation of a global situation where individuals may not have a proof of legal identity, and migrants without legal identity, and what could be the various ways of supporting them, of helping them in these situations. So this has just come out as well. We don't have a QR code for it, but we are happy to provide this as required to anyone who may. You can just write to us and let us know. The free movement zone guide, as I mentioned, you are familiar with the different movement frameworks here, but this guide is a more detailed perspective. Specifically, and this I know that this has been of great help, particularly in Africa, where different countries are actually looking at potential free movement zones. So this is that document. We have the introduction to biometrics manual as well. Interesting for colleagues who may be working on the hardware side and understanding that detail. The passport examination procedure manual, as I had mentioned, we've just in May or June this year, we've just launched the 3rd version. The app, which is associated with this manual, is downloadable if I remember correctly. We have this QR code is for Android. I understand the iOS version is also coming out. And the idea of this is, and again, we provide capacity building and training on this as well for all border officials, immigration officials dealing with documents, legal identity documents and travel documents, fraudulent documents, identifying fraudulent documents, and identifying the various challenges of morphing, of document fraud, of changes, etc. So this is both the manual and the app are part of the entire capacity building. We usually do an initial training is done, and then there are master trainings available as well for individuals, so that governments can actually continue building capacity of officials in different the document examination lab. Now, this is something for anyone who's interested. I'd prefer you to speak to Olivier, because this is one of the growing interests in the region as well. And we are looking at that. There's been discussions on creating such a document examination lab there, wherein you can actually understand the roles and responsibilities of document verification specialists, and the how to use the equipment, how to manage it, the different equipment activities, the equipment maintenance, etc. So this is there's a manual which will explain all of that, but then essentially having that lab as well. And with that, I'm going to close and thank you all, and remain on standby for answering any questions that anyone may have. Thank you very much for your time and all your attention. Thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you very much for your interest, and really look forward to the possibility of working on these challenges. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, María, por esta presentación. Rápidamente voy a pasarle la palabra a Perla. Ella es de OIM Belice y nos va a hablar sobre una experiencia de un centro de registro de personas migrantes. Entonces, le cedo la palabra a Perla. Por favor, adelante.
Thank you, Marisol. I'll speak in English because I'm more comfortable talking in English. Pero buenos días a todos. I wanted to present on Belize's unique experience, I think, in addressing legal identity. And of course, this began in 2022 when Belize started an amnesty program. And they had several criteria that they were working with to address irregular migrants in the country. And a few of them that I'll touch on are if they were registered asylum seekers, residing in Belize before 2016, had at least one child born in Belize before 2021, completed primary, secondary, or tertiary education in Belize, were married to a citizen of Belize for at least 1 year, were in a common law union with a citizen of Belize for at least 5 years. Any referrals from the Department of Human Services, and this included minors, adolescents, and victims of human trafficking, and if they also maintained gainful and legal employment in Belize for 5 years as well. And so from the amnesty, IOM did a lot of outreach, and so I'll just quickly share my screen so you can see some pictures as well of what we've done. 1 second. Hopefully you can see. And from the amnesty, we saw that there were a lot of people that weren't applying for the amnesty were actually people who were regular in the country but didn't have access to their documents, or even Belizeans who struggled to get their legal identity needs met. And so we began doing a village survey in 2020, the end of 2023, to be able to survey 20 villages in the Toledo district, which is a district that has indigenous peoples, and is around the border areas as well. And so out of these 20 villages, we were then able to do targeted outreach. Actually, one of the last outreaches that we did were last week. And we were able to cover all the 20 villages that we surveyed, and we were able to help approximately 119 people with renewing their nationality certificates, their permanent resident cards, and filling out their applications as well. Apart from that, we have also done identity and integration hubs this year, and we have done about 15 events, and we have been able to see approximately 2,362 persons. And from those 2,000 people, 728 were supported through Ministry of Immigration, specifically the Department of Nationality and Passport Services, where people were able to apply for passports. So we were supporting regular pathways. People were also able to renew their nationality certificates or permanent resident cards as well. People were also able to apply for border crossing cards in the communities that it was needed as well. We also helped with Social Security card applications. About 419 people were able to access that. And then lastly, about 516 people were supported with vital statistics services. And a partnership here that was crucial was with UNICEF, who were able to provide that service and come along with us to ensure that those services were met. And so the identity and integration hubs were also kind of like an extension from where we came from the amnesty. We saw that during the amnesty, that doing outreach and meeting people where they were was essential to be able to ensure access to services. And then we replicated this for the identity and integration hubs as well. So I just wanted to share a little bit of our experience, the people that we've reached, what we've been able to do. And this was really to target services to those most in need. So thank you for giving me the time to present.
Thank you so much, Perla, to give us this presentation and this experience about the registration hub that you had in Belize. Bueno, en aras del tiempo sabemos que ya estamos como sobre el límite, pero de igual forma no quisiera dejar sin dar la palabra también a los participantes. Si quieren rápidamente decirnos algo, alguna consulta, algún comentario, creo que ahorita sería el momento. Ok. Bueno, no veo manos levantadas. De igual forma nos pueden escribir al correo de la CRM y nosotros lo remitimos con cada uno de los expositores que tuvimos el día de hoy. En ese sentido le daría entonces la palabra de nuevo a la PPT para que puedan darnos unas palabras de cierre.
Thanks again, once again, Marisol. Delegations and honored guests, good morning once again. As we conclude this important webinar, I want to express my gratitude to all of you for your participation. The discussions we have had are foundational to our work in ensuring that all migrants are recognized and respected. I also extend my gratitude to the International Organization for Migration, our leading partner in supporting this crucial initiative. Today, we have heard the challenges such as inconsistency in national, regional processes and initiatives, and some of the solutions to legal identity, such as increasing modernization between institutions and countries. Importantly, we have seen how critical it is to continue developing and refining the services we offer. These advancements not only support the rights of migrants, but also reinforce our shared regional goals under the RCM framework. Belize remains committed to leading these efforts and to ensuring that the discussions we have had today translate into concrete actions. Let us carry forward the knowledge and strategies discussed, ensuring that our work continues to be driven by a commitment to inclusion and human dignity. Together, we are building a region where every individual is recognized, protected, and empowered to fully contribute to our shared prosperity. Thank you once again for your participation.
Muchas gracias a todos y a todas. En el chat les hemos compartido un forms que agradecemos que lo puedan abrir y también llenarlo. No van a durar más de 5 minutos y para nosotros es muy importante para poder tener data del evento. Muchísimas gracias y como dijimos anteriormente, si tienen algún comentario, alguna duda, nos pueden escribir al correo de la CRM y con mucho gusto lo remitimos a los panelistas del día de hoy, que también les agradecemos por haberse conectado y por haber preparado las presentaciones. Muchas gracias y nos vemos en un próximo evento.
Muchas gracias.